Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 5 today as David is consolidating the legitimacy of his royal reign, as you can see on the right side of the screen. And last video, we noted how he took the stronghold of Zion from the Jebusites to become the city of David. And now we'll see a couple of things. We'll see him gain the powerful support of King Hiram of Tyre, as you can see on the left side of the screen. And after that, we'll see the display of masculine power and fertility as he takes more women who are unnamed and has more children. So as we go through this, I would encourage you, if you haven't watched it, to look at the introductory video to this whole unit of 2 Samuel 5 to 10, where I go over some of the themes that we're looking at and the different perceptions of how we can read this from the story world or from later time periods to help explain it. As we look at keywords, there's not a lot in today's passage in these couple of paragraphs here, but as we note, David is the theme. David mentioned over and over and over again, and note how he's not named as King David here, although he will perceive, literally to know, that Yahweh's exalted his kingdom. He's not titled King David, but David, David, David over and over and over again. So that's the theme. It's all about David. And then what we see in this one verse where there's a lot going on is suddenly out of nowhere we hear of a new character and a new place, King Hiram of Tyre. And we'll look at that in detail in a minute, who sent messengers to David along with cedar trees and carpenters and masons who built David a house. And there's a lot going on there that's a question, and we're going to look at a couple of the details about that. But one of the things is, how does King Hiram of Tyre know about David becoming king? If we look at the map, Tyre, as you may well know, is one of two cities, Tyre and Sidon, that compose the central places of the Phoenician Empire, which was a powerful maritime empire, and we'll see in 1 Kings in just a minute that King Hiram and Solomon, David's son, of course, combined their fleets in trade routes, gathering gold and other valuables. But these two cities were well established, and as we'll look at in a minute, Tyre is a subject of prophetic denunciation in the centuries just after this and up through the exile period. And so Tyre and Sidon had already been well established as bases of the Phoenician kingdom that eventually went all the way from Gibraltar at the corner where the Atlantic meets the Mediterranean, and all the way down to Carthage in North Africa, which is one of their colonies. So why would this king know about David taking over the stronghold of Zion, an obscure location down here in the Jerusalem area, way down here? And how would he know about that up here? Obviously no social media, no newspapers, no nothing. And we've seen no previous relationship between the people up here and David, and certainly not with Saul, who is primarily just in this small area down here around his hometown of Gibeon, in this immediate area where Jerusalem is. So this is the farthest distance anybody has become aware that we know of, that there's a monarchy in Jerusalem. And we need to look at the details. First of all, why is he sending messengers to David? We don't hear anything about those messengers. What we hear about is the trees and the carpenters and mason who build David a house. And so let's look at the details here. This is the first time we hear of Hiram, and he's described as king here. He won't be in other places. As my note from Pockelman below has, he compares Hiram with the Jebusite. And if you don't know what that means, the Jebusite, I noted that although the NORSV has Jebusites, the Hebrew has simply the Jebusite. And so he notes the one party hurls abusive but impotent jeers at David about the blind and the lame, as we saw last time. The other furnishes constructive deeds. The Jebusite sends the paper tiger of the lame and blind into the ring against David. Hiram sends David skilled craftsmen and supplies him with stately accommodation. And that's one way to look at it, but as I noted last time, it might not be the Jebusites are sending the blind and the lame against David. It may well be that that's David's note, but that's from last video. So let's look what we know about King Hiram. This is the first time he's mentioned, but he's mentioned here as if we know him. And of course, as consecutive readers, we don't. But perhaps the case is that the mentions of him here in 1 Kings in the Solomon era were written earlier than the story we see in 2 Samuel 5. And I'm not going to argue that in detail, and I'm not looking at sources here, as many scholars do, for reasons I've discussed a number of times, both in this sequence and also in the Genesis sequence here at Radical Bible. But I've certainly suggested that the succession narrative, the story of Solomon succeeding David, which is probably the most controversial part of this entire story, may well have been written first to justify why Solomon is on the throne. And as I was noting in the introductory video to this unit, at least certainly this chapter and the next chapter have a lot of Deuteronomistic evidence around them, and we'll see that around the issue of Egypt and a number of other echoes of Deuteronomistic language. And so that would suggest it's written sometime later, whether in the time of Josiah or maybe in the 620s, and there's some hint event of that time period in our story, as we'll see in a minute, or perhaps at some other time, perhaps even after the monarchy had fallen in the exilic period. But one of the reasons I'm raising that is because King Hiram of Tyre, as you can see here, is introduced in 1 Kings 7 as if he's a new character there. Now, King Solomon received Hiram from Tyre, notice not named as a king there. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, which is interesting, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and therefore would make him an Israelite. That seems completely impossible, but that's what we hear here. Whose father, a man of Tyre, had been an artisan in bronze. He was full of skill, intelligence, and knowledge in working bronze. That's not clear if that's Hiram or his father. But his father seems to be an ordinary artisan, not a royal figure. And how this ordinary artisan bred the king of Tyre, we don't know, and the text doesn't tell us. But it says he came to King Solomon and did all his work. And it suggests that Hiram himself, as a king, is literally doing the bronze work himself, that he's making these things. It says explicitly, Hiram made the pots, shovels, and the basins. So that would be very unusual that someone who's a king of a powerful maritime empire would get down on his hands and knees and be working the bronze himself, but that's what that text tells us. But an important thing to recognize too is that in 1 Kings 5, after Solomon has been made king, King Hiram of Tyre sent his servants to Solomon and sent word saying, Solomon sent word saying, you know, my father David could not build a house for the name of Yahweh his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until Yahweh put them under the soles of his feet. Now, we'll see in our unit when we get to 1 Samuel 7, that is not at all the reason that Yahweh says why David is not to build Yahweh a house. The primary reason is Yahweh doesn't live in a house. Yahweh lived in a tent and a tabernacle and is free. And he will not be David's pet like Saul's grandson Mephibosheth will be, captive in the royal household. So it had nothing to do with the warfare. So Solomon is giving another reason, completely different than the reason we will see in 2 Samuel 7. And again, we have to ask the question, but it's at some level unanswerable about which of those came first. So we see King Hiram in the second generation. That means he must be pretty young here, because we found just a few verses earlier in 2 Samuel 5 that David reigned for 40 years, and we'd heard that he entered into his reign at the age of 30. Now, given that those might be just round numbers for easy's sake, 40 certainly being a number of fullness in the Bible, of 40 years in the wilderness, etc. But if we take it at some literal level, David is certainly king for a long time and was an old man by then, and so Hiram would be an old man too, presumably, at the time of Solomon. And we don't know if he came to Solomon right at the beginning, and we don't know how long he was in relationship with David here, but certainly Hiram would have been an old and experienced king by that time. And then we'll see further down in the relationship between Solomon and Hiram, these exchanges of 20 cities in exchange for 120 talents of gold, which is an unbelievable amount. We'll look at that when we get to 1 Kings, of course. But what we see is after having established this relationship as a builder and supplier of timber, Hiram will go on with Solomon to be building this fleet of ships, of course built out of wood, and you can see an example of Phoenician ships right here. And then here's another example of a Phoenician ship unloading at a port, carrying not only 420 talents of gold, but a great quantity of almug wood and precious stones. And once every 3 years, the fleet came with all those things. So a long-established relationship seems to be going on between Hiram and the fleet of Tyre and the fleet of Solomon coming from Jerusalem. So much for Tyre. But what about, or so much for Hiram, but what about Tyre? Tyre is not mentioned before this other than in Joshua, just a mention of its location and nothing else there. But we see just a few examples of the many uses of it. First, in the Psalms here, very similar to what we see in our passages, especially in the King's passage I just showed you. The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, the richest of the people with all kinds of wealth. So certainly Tyre famous for wealth. And then we see prophetic oracles against Tyre in Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. So a long one in Isaiah, this is only a small piece of it. The oracle concerning Tyre, wail, O ships of Tarshish, another city in the Phoenician Empire that centuries later a guy named Saul came from, who becomes an evangelist for Jesus. You may know him as Paul. For your fortress is destroyed. And so prediction of destruction there. In Ezekiel, similarly, because Tyre said concerning Jerusalem, "Aha, broken is the gateway of the peoples, it is swung open to me," which is to say the Babylonians have destroyed Jerusalem. And so now the Tyre's, Ezekiel's quote is suggesting that Tyre is seeing the chance for gathering the booty that Babylon's left behind. But the oracle says that Lord Yahweh says, "I am against you all, O Tyre, and will hurl many nations against you as the sea hurls its waves." Just the kind of thing to say to a maritime empire. And finally, in Zechariah, we hear Tyre has built itself a rampart and heaped up silver like dust and gold like the dirt of the streets. But now Yahweh will strip it of its possessions and hurl its wealth into the sea. It shall be devoured by fire. So negative things about Tyre, but almost always about wealth. So that wealth being legendary, and then the cause of its destruction because of arrogance. And there's another oracle in Isaiah around that. So what about the carpenters and masons? I guess we should take a step back and look at the cedar trees here. Cedar first mentioned here, and the famous cedars of Lebanon, which you can see a remnant of in this picture here. As scholars note, Lebanon was covered with cedars back in the time of our story, but for the obvious reasons we know throughout history, very little of it is left, and just patches of it preserved in this state park you can see here in Lebanon. So cedar trees, and these references below are to the very passages I was showing us in the Hiram passages, and a couple more later. And the trees element, not only just mentioning cedar, but mentioning trees, leads Joel Rosenberg to suggest one of the many hints of David in Jerusalem is parallel with Adam in the garden and his narrative, King and Kin, where he sees the Genesis stories of family and kinship stories is very similar to the monarchy stories, and I've been using that as a basis for showing many of the connections. I'm reading Genesis as a counter story written later against the monarchy story. The carpenters and masons, though, form an interesting echo later. Literally, the phrase from the Hebrew, Vaharashe Etz and Vaharashe Evan, is engravers of trees and engravers of stones. But let's look at the two passages that are referenced in my note there below. So here's our current one, carpenters and masons who build David a house. And this is the first time that this third meaning of house is established. We've seen the meaning of house we will see the meaning of house in chapter 7 as a temple. We've certainly seen we'll see the meaning of house as a dynasty, but here it's the residence, the palace, if you will, of David. But is it just that? Because we see in these examples in Kings later. I didn't note this is 2 Kings. I should have put 2 Kings there. So in this point, midway in the monarchy, we see that money has been gathered, and the high priest and the king's secretary are counting it and piling it up. They would give the money that was weighed out into the hands of the workers who had the oversight of the house of Yahweh. They paid it to the carpenters and the builders, to the masons and stonecutters for making repairs on the house of Yahweh. And similarly here we see in the reign of Josiah, go up to the priest Hilkiah and have him count the entire sum of the money. Notice how similar this is, 10 chapters apart, but very similar. Let it be given into the hands of the workers who have the oversight of the house of Yahweh, virtually identical to this, repairing the house, that is to the carpenters, the builders, and the masons. And what I'd like to suggest, and we'll see it there, that repairing the house is not just about the physical temple, but the house of Yahweh as the monarchy itself. That Josiah will repair the house in the sense of trying to pull Judah and Israel together. And the very next verse here, Hilkiah finds a text which scholars agree is the early version of Deuteronomy, and that's the basis for Josiah's so-called reform, and that will also be the basis after the exile for Ezra and Nehemiah establishing their regime with the idea that foreign women are to be excluded, and foreign children of Israelites and foreign women should be excluded. And Solomon in 1 Kings 11 will be the first one who's accused by the narrator of having gone astray because of foreign women. So we'll see that Deuteronomistic theme all the way from 1 Kings 11 all the way to Ezra. And it's hinted at in these scenes here. So when we have it here back in 2 Samuel 5, where there's no sense of David wanting to build a temple yet, that will only come after he perceives that I'm living in a house of cedar, but Yahweh is living in a tent, that this is suggesting a relationship with the temple and with the monarchy, the united monarchy itself. And it's this event that King Hiram sends his messengers along with the trees and the workers that leads David to know, not just perceive, as NORSV has weakly here, but to know that Yahweh had established him king over Israel and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. And isn't that interesting? Because we saw just a few verses earlier that after the death of Abner, the people of Israel said, "You are our bone and flesh," and they came to him and decided to make him king. And he became king. And we already saw the narrative summary that he reigned over Judah and Hebron for 7 years and over Israel and Judah together in Jerusalem for 33 years for a total of a 40-year reign. But it's only now after Hiram comes that David has this inner experience that Yahweh had established him as king. The word for established, kon, that we've seen a number of times earlier, and we'll see it especially in the story of the building of the temple in 2 Samuel 7 and the question of the dynasty. So a number of hints that the narrator is setting us up for that key chapter. Notice establish him king over Israel, but not over Judah. Is it the idea that he already knew he was king over Judah, and it's the tentativeness of the reign over Israel that's the issue? That it wasn't just enough that the people of Israel came and wanted him to be king out of their fear, but now he perceives that Yahweh is on his side. And it's interesting that it's the coming of a foreign king along with these workers that leads him to perceive that Yahweh is on his side, in the sense that a foreigner is coming to build him a palace. And that he'd exalted his kingdom, literally had lifted it up 93 times in Samuel the Kings. And the kingdom, as a substantive noun here, Mamluktav, we saw it earlier in 2 Samuel 3, and we'll see it again in chapter 7, another hint that this is setting up the story in chapter 7. And Falcom notes that, a quote, a prelude to the solemn words of the crucial text of 7:8-16. For the sake of his people Israel. So what we see in verse 12 is David perceives two things. That he is raised up in a sense that he's established as king, that his stock is risen, so to speak, but it's also that Yahweh is doing this for the sake of Israel. So he's not king just for his own reputation or his own glory, but for the sake of Israel. And again, that will be a key theme in chapter 7. So then the story shifts radically, and as I was noting in the Acts of Royal Consolidation in the introductory video, the display of masculine power and fertility here is a substitute in a monotheistic culture or in a henotheistic culture here. Henotheism meaning the belief that there are multiple gods, but the choice to worship only one, in this case Yahweh, of course. Monotheism not being really established in the biblical text till after exile, for reasons we'll look at in exilic texts, and we've looked at in the Genesis series. So now these wives and children express David's fertility as a substitute for what in a polytheistic culture would be the hieros gamos, the ritual by which the king has symbolic intercourse with a woman who's designated for that act, to symbolize the sky father and the earth mother goddess and god and goddess coming together to bring fertility, the rain from the sky and the plants from the earth. But in the absence of that kind of view, it has to be the fertility of the king himself that is at issue. So notice it's naming Jerusalem. In the previous scene, it had been the city of David, that he took the stronghold of Zion and named it the city of David, which we're told twice in the previous scene. But now it's Jerusalem. And after Jerusalem is mentioned here and mentioned here at the end of this little introductory summary, it won't be mentioned until 8:7, after the whole story of the question of building the temple. So it's interesting to track how the narrator uses Jerusalem and the city of David alternately. As we saw last time with the atlas, the city of David is a small part of the larger picture of Jerusalem then and now. And so we see here that he, after he came from Hebron, reminding us that he'd ruled there over Judah, and noting the absence of Judah in the recognition of his kingship here, Hebron will not be noted again until 15:7 when Absalom goes there to try to generate support for his rebellion against his father, recognizing the original place of David's reign there. So he goes back to the root of it. And so it's mentioned here to highlight David's root. And he took what kings do, as we saw in 1 Samuel 8, they take women, they take your sons, and they take. So David took. Concubines is not a good word now. Modern scholarship has seen that word as a sexist and unnecessary description of Pelagashim, which is secondary wives. He took more of those. And notice the secondary wives are named before the first wives, simply women here. There's no word for wife or husband in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew. So he took secondary wives, secondary women, and primary women, but none of them are named. And just generically, there's a summary. More sons and daughters. Oh, no daughters are named here, born to David. And we don't hear anything about who those women are in the patriarchal image here. The women aren't important. All that's important here is the male fertility. It's as if the sons came from him, and that's even what the language has. They were born to him, as if the women had almost nothing to do with it. You notice a little chiasm here in 13 and 14, starting with Jerusalem, ending with Jerusalem, and the sons named here and the names of them there. And there's this long list of names, and hidden inside this list is Solomon. This Nathan here is certainly not, can't be the prophet, can it? Who we'll note in chapter 7. We don't know the times of these, and plainly the Solomon story, birth, only takes place after the scene that takes place in 2 Samuel 12, a number of chapters from now. So these are plainly not all being born right now before this next scene in verse 17. This is a summary of all the children he had in the entire time he was king. So 6 children born to him in Hebron and 11 here in Jerusalem. And Solomon is just listed in the middle with no notice at all, and certainly no mention of his mother Bathsheba. And then there's these 3 here who are mentioned. Notice that only these 3 have anything like theophoric names, which is say something of the name of God, but all El. Nothing about Yah, like Isaiah or Joshua, those kinds of things. Nothing about Yahweh here, which is interesting. Elishama is mentioned once there. Maybe it's the same one, maybe it's not. The same with Eliad and the same with Eliphelet. All 3 of those are mentioned, but we don't know if they're the same ones or not. So with that, we know that David has a place to call his own. He has a powerful supporter in the king Hiram of Tyre, and he has plenty of fertility to be king. And now we're going to see if he's powerful enough to defeat the Philistines, which is why they wanted a king in the first place back in 1 Samuel 8. We'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye.